packet pushers.
Welcome to the IPv6 Buzz, where we dare to dive into the 128-bit address space wormhole. I'm Ed Horley.
And I'm Scott Hogue. On the show, we discuss all things IPv6, strategy, design, deployment, and operations.
And I'm Tom Coffeen. We've spent 20 plus years working with the IPv6 protocol. We run a consulting firm where we get IPv6 working for our customers.
And we're here to share some lessons learned and how to avoid common mistakes.
We're glad you've joined us today. We're going to be talking about enterprise, Microsoft Windows, Active Directory, and its impact with the introduction of IPv6. Tom Coffeen is out this week, and with me is our special guest, Ed Horley. Ed Horley, welcome to the show.
Gee, thanks.
Ed has been a co-host of a very popular podcast on IPv6. He's been involved in the California IPv6 task force, experienced engineering leaders, worked on networks and systems and software for decades. He's published author of Practical IPv6 for Windows Administrators, and he's an author of a Pluralsight course on IPv6 and teaches classes, consults to enterprises on IPv6. So Ed, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah. So let's talk about, as an enterprise starts to consider, IPv6 deployment, one of the first steps is get your addresses. Wish Tom was here to talk about that. But then the next thing is, build out your core network infrastructure with IPv6. And then as you start to IPv6 enable shared services, because you need those shared services to be v6 active,
right,
before you start to roll out IPv6 to other areas of your network, like end user networks, segments. And you need those shared services to be v6 capable, certainly if you're going to v6 only desktops and things like that. So it's going to be on your critical path to v6 enable Active Directory infrastructure. So Ed, let me ask you, considering the wide adoption of Microsoft Windows Active Directory in the network, are there concerns or design issues that you think about and advise a client when they're adopting IPv6?
Yeah, definitely, for sure. You're so funny. I appreciate all the intro. Yeah, I think there's a bunch of things that you need to consider, especially specifically around designing Active Directory, because designing Active Directory is different in its own sake versus designing like a network topology. And we spend a lot of time on the show talking about building networks specifically, right? And all the aspects that go along with that. And there are many services that are sort of adjacent to core sets of networking that are super important, but Windows Active Directory is really sort of its core function, is really all about identity management to a great degree, a sort of on-premises identity management, along with other services to manage, computers, servers, other nodes on the network that might participate in Active Directory itself. And so there's many different attributes. It's just basically a large distributed dynamic database, realistically. And so there's other things that you need to be thinking about when you're thinking about Windows specifically and Active Directory in particular, in terms of design side. And so I think when adopting v6, the first thing that sort of goes on is your network team probably comes up with, an address allocation, an address plan. So something that's in sort of Tom's wheelhouse of talking about like, okay, we need to think at a high level about how to get addresses sort of deployed across the organization. You've already probably walked into a network in v4 that already had all this done, right? These sort of networks have been running around for a long time. And more than likely in your Active Directory configurations, sites and services, sites and subnets, things like that, you've laid out what that schema looks like. So Active Directory knows how to do things like replication across your network, across whether that's a WAN interface or is this LAN, and, different geographies and topologies that match up so that Windows sort of gets an inkling or an idea of what the topology of your network actually looks like, because it can't glean it from any other method, right? You actually have to go in and provide this information to Windows in order to figure this stuff out. And so I think for many organizations, they've forgotten that they actually did that.
Mm-hmm.
They've forgotten that they've done that process in a formal way, and they may not even have it documented particularly well about how that works. But these design decisions actually impact everything from which name servers you may go to resolve namespaces, where you go to resolve Kerberos authentication, where you go and get your time services from. Like there's all these attributes that are just sort of inherently built into Active Directory in terms of distributing to an end client device about where it's supposed to go to authenticate itself as a compute node on the network that's supposed to be joined to this particular domain and has a valid Kerberos certificate to be able to go access resources on some other device, including cloud devices. So, if you're running stuff in Azure or something of that nature. So your design considerations around thinking about how the network is built for both v4 and v6, and they don't necessarily have to be congruent, which is really important, right? You may have different v6 setup in your v4. That has to be reflected in your Active Directory deployment, how you think about it, and where you locate services, because the key sets of services for Active Directory and where they're located probably want to be co-resident with your data center, right?
Mhm.
In terms of what you run and maintain there. And more than likely, you want those services to be available to both v4 and IPv6. With that in mind, you're probably going to dual stack those particular services. But you could, in theory, run a separate v6 only set of services that are only available that way and only have a small number of maybe Active Directory domain controllers that are actually dual stack that sort of traffic the information back and forth between v4 and v6. And it really depends on what your topology looks like and how big your enterprise is, and if you have multiple forests and how you actually are splitting things up for an administrative and boundary basis, right? Or whether you're delegating administrative controls over to other people. There's a lot to sort of put into the giant bucket of design and thinking around how you're going to adopt v6 within your probably existing deployment and Active Directory sort of setup. And that goes with just about every single other Active Directory related set of technologies, right? Is that you're going to have to think more carefully about it, because those design decisions, like I said before, were probably made a long time ago, right?
Mhm.
When they were first deploying this stuff back for, 2000 or NT 351 or whatever, way back when they were first taking a strike at getting Active Directory deployed.
Yeah, because an enterprise's v4 address space is probably quite fragmented and chopped up and maybe split along different zones and realms and forests and stuff. But when you start out with v6, it's a clean slate. And so how would you lay it out clean slate? And so imagine I'm an AD administrator. I'm a lowly and pretty poor, frankly, AD administrator. What do I need to learn, and what should I be thinking about as we embark on IPv6? What's my role in this whole enterprise IPv6 process or program or transformation?
Yeah, I think some really important things. Well, obviously, get training and educated on v6 so that you at least have the basics under your belt. So I think that's super important, just to go out and get the core set of understanding v6 prefixes, understanding how, to some degree, just being able to roll up address space, nibble boundaries, all the fundamentals, just so you don't make mistakes in typing or configuring anything in Active Directory itself, which I think that's super important.
Right. I shouldn't be building scopes with like a /65 prefix length.
Yeah,
Okay.
exactly. But I think in terms of what you learn for deployment reasons, right, and how you need to think from a deployment basis, I think it's really important to be hand in hand with whoever's doing the actual address plan portion, so that you really understand how they're thinking about address administration across your enterprise, because that's going to impact how you want to do replication, where you want services located, and how you're actually going to set up those services within Active Directory itself. And so you want to have, I guess, more than a mental model. You actually want to build out diagrams that actually represent what this looks like topology wise for yourself, and that they match up with what your network team is doing. So you are going to have a pretty set of extensive conversations with your network team about where services live. Is this something where you're centralizing a core set of data center services and maybe you're consolidating down into data centers, or maybe you're pushing things out to be locally accessible because you're migrating to SD-WAN and local internet hop off, and you're not constraining everyone to localized firewalls inside of data centers. So maybe you need to get a certain set of services pushed further out, closer to where those end users are, right? And so you want to make sure that that's reflected in sites and services, sites and subnets, so that way they know where to go get the right set of services to go do the authentication they require, or to go get a key set of services that they require to go ahead and not backhaul across your SD-WAN or your WAN environment in order to go do that, but they have those things locally available to them. If you don't take that into consideration, v6 will look like a pretty flat network to it, and you'll end up sending, because v6 is preferred, and the moment you turn v6 on for an end client, it's going to prefer the v6 related topology information. suddenly you may have this like Active Directory server off in some remote corner of your network that you didn't realize was suddenly like the v6 lookup server for everything that you're doing. And you're sending all your traffic there because you didn't actually design stuff out. And so we've seen cases where you get weird traffic patterns and long Kerberos timeout authentication problems and things like that because you're sending traffic the other side of the planet, quite literally, to go do something when realistically it had a much closer service to operate with. And that was true in v4 because someone put the entry in, but it's not true in v6 because no entry was put in.
Yeah, we've talked about that on this show where dual stack kind of hides problems.
Yeah.
With either protocol, you have two options. And when these Active Directory servers are using v4 and v6, they may be using one or the other behind the scenes, or maybe one's broken or the other one's working. So you don't really know which one it's choosing. And so I've heard that Microsoft doesn't want their customers to turn off IPv6 or go in and disable it as a protocol. And they've threatened to not give you enterprise support if you've turned it off. And there's things inside of these servers that are active with IPv6 already, even maybe using link local addresses.
Yeah.
So what are some of these other potential negative impacts or things where things may actually be using IPv6 unbeknownst to me, the lowly AD admin? What things could I end up troubleshooting or what could go wrong?
It's a fantastic point because I think the fact that Windows actually behaves incredibly well in dual stack environments is a blessing and a curse at the same moment, right? In terms of really trying to figure out what Happy Eyeballs is doing and what the host OS is actually doing behind the scenes. And it may be masking these problems. And unless you're, skilled in terms of understanding what's being kicked out to you in log files and actually being proactive in terms of looking through those, it may be very difficult to figure out exactly what's going on in your environment. So to your point, in terms of understanding where things might bite you, you have to remember that IPv6 is a global unicast address, right? It's globally routable, and assuming that your network team is actually setting things up to be globally accessible, there's challenges that go along with just having things just globally able to get out and do things on the internet. That's inclusive of some of the transition protocols that were originally put in the Windows operating system. Now, most of these were turned off for client devices. So like Windows 10 and Windows 11 don't have things like Teredo and ISOTAP and 6-4 necessarily on by default, but that's not necessarily true for the server side. For the server side, you still could have 6-4 enabled. And so if you were in a shop that maybe was using, surprisingly, using public IPv4 addresses on maybe your DMZ and you're still running Exchange or something of that nature, right? It's going to attempt to try and auto configure some of these transition technologies and use v6 in a way that maybe you're not ready for yet.
Yeah, those are like older versions of Windows. I thought 2019 and later, like those tunneling techniques were deprecated.
Yeah, they deprecated it, but just it's something to look out for.
They could be activated accidentally, though.
Right. You could do that. And so those are things that sort of keep in the back of your mind. You're like, is this doing what I think it's doing? And maybe I should check really quickly just to make sure it's not trying to send v6 related traffic outbound. Because, if you didn't do the effort of, old school setting up your SPF records and DKIM and then all the other newer methods to validate, senders, and you don't have any v6 information in there, well, suddenly you don't look like legitimate traffic anymore. Right. So that could be problematic. Luckily, most of those protocols fall back to v4 pretty gracefully. Like, that's not a big of a deal. If it can't reach it via v6, it'll fall back to v4 and do that. But it won't necessarily do that if it just is being rejected as it didn't have the right certificate or something of that nature, right? So
yeah, but that would be a problem for a v6 only laptop. There'd be no fallback option.
Right, exactly. And so those are the sort of nuanced things that you need to be thinking about as an admin when you're going through and trying to troubleshoot. You're like, I don't understand what the heck is going on. We're getting this weird behavior where these clients over on this site are operating just fine. Everything's getting through. It's amazing. It's not a problem. And then we're over here and this is dual stacked and everything's working fine. But then over here, like what's different? And it's like part of it's v6 only, or we had some problems with our v4 routes maybe, and like our v4 portion is like broken on our network, but we didn't really realize it because we had v6 too. So a bunch of v6 services are working, but a bunch of other v6 services aren't operating in the same way that we thought. So you can get some really interesting sort of different layers of like troubleshooting problems that you have to work your way through. And so really understanding how Windows is affected negatively by v6 is part of the thing you have to walk your way through from a troubleshooting basis, right? Because of sort of the transition elements that were made available in Windows, you have to sort of make sure that you're going through your checklist and sort of double checking everything that's going on there. And then in addition, it's sort of the obvious thing that a lot of people come in, there's like a handful of folks that automatically say, well, can't we just turn either IPv4 off or IPv6 off, like one or the other, right? And with Windows, one of the challenges when they redid the networking stack in Windows Vista is that's not really possible, right? It's a dual IP protocol stack. It's not possible to turn v4 off. It's not possible to turn v6 off. And TCP and UDP are shared across the top of that joint stack. So it's not possible to build like a single v6 only stack or a single v4 only stack like it is on like a Linux machine. You can absolutely just turn off one of the stacks if you want to and have that device operate that way. So there's a whole set of inherent challenges that go along with just knowing how to troubleshoot a device that is always going to have an IPv6 address on it, or is always going to have, or attempt to always have a IPv4 address on it too. Even though you think you may be operating in a v6 only network, like, doesn't a pip address show up every single time? Because it's still got v4 turned on it. So those are things that you need to be thinking about. And does that cause problems for your help desk? And does it cause problems for Active Directory? And does it attempt to register those things in DNS? And it doesn't, but that's okay. But at least you need to know that, right? In terms of troubleshooting and thinking through it. I don't know. Did I miss anything? Or
no, that's good. Yeah, Microsoft definitely, they frown upon their customers recompiling their kernel like on their own.
Is that an option?
Yeah. No.
Maybe for students. I mean, I think aren't the students up at the University of Washington?
I downloaded the code off the internet and off the dark web.
I think the University of Washington
ran GCC and compiled my own kernel.
Yeah, I think the students there the computer science students have access for portions of the source code for Windows to be able to learn from. So
it's probably just MS-DOS, like
something like that. Yeah.
Somewhere. Yeah. 5.0. Yeah.
Thanks for being a Packet Pushers listener. Did you know we've got other IT-related shows you might want to check out, like Heavy Wireless? Heavy Wireless is a deep dive into Wi-Fi, IoT, wireless security, and more. It's hosted by Keith Parsons. He brings decades of experience to conversations with wireless engineers, industry experts, and vendors. So whether you're a WLAN specialist already or looking to expand your skill sets, Heavy Wireless gives you the technical know-how and industry insights to succeed. Find it at packetpushers.net or wherever you get your podcasts.
So one of the weird things I've seen on Windows hosts is if a laptop comes up and it doesn't have any IPv6 DNS servers learned through Slack, a stateless DHCP or stateful DHCP, RADNSS, these computers end up with these IPv6 site local DNS servers, these FEC0:0:0:0:FFFF:1:2:2:2. These weird DNS servers.
Yeah.
You've seen those. And when you do a netsh int IPv6 show DNS, like why do those show up? I thought site local addresses were deprecated. Is that a problem? Should an Active Directory or Windows administrator be worried about those FEC0 addresses showing up in DNS servers?
Yeah, that's a good question. That's a legacy holdover from when site local addresses were still a thing before they got deprecated. They were included in the Windows OS and they were just never removed. There was part of the spec for site local addresses was to have what were considered just default universal reserved DNS name IP addresses to go ahead and pre-populate into host operating systems that were a fallback that just allowed any host to come up on a site local network and know where the DNS servers were. Those are those entries. That reflects what's going on there.
Yeah.
They're a holdover. Site local addresses in the prefix policy table are depreferenced all the way down to the lowest possible settings so that you hopefully won't use them at all.
Probably going to use v4 for DNS if it's a dual stack system. But if it's a v6 only system and your system ends up with these, then you don't have a valid DNS server and you know you've done something wrong, I guess.
For me, I sort of look at it the same way that when you have a v4 box and you suddenly see an APIPA address on your box, you're like, oh, my DHCP server isn't working. I almost see this as like, oh, my RDNSS or my DHCP v6 DNS entries aren't working either. And that's how I know, because I see those entry sets in the device because it wasn't able to get a legitimate DNS name server to do name resolution. So that's sort of how I think about those.
Yeah.
I've asked the Microsoft team, hey, can you remove those? Their answer was, we're not taking anything out unless it's an absolute necessary.
You can take it out yourself if you can recompile the kernel.
Yeah. They said that's a cosmetic thing, not a functional thing. So don't worry about it. Just ignore it. But a lot of people notice it. So
yeah, I guess maybe it's a clue that you've done something wrong and you haven't given the v6 laptop a valid v6 DNS server through one of those methods.
I would probably try and put it in that category to be gracious.
Yeah.
But yeah, I
Yeah.
would probably prefer just not to see anything and be like, oh, well, it just doesn't have anything. That's, to me, would be a good indication too that is not working.
An AD administrator needs to configure v6 DNS, forward lookup zones, reverse mapping zones using the v6 address plan you talked about. They need to set up DHCP v6, similar to how they've done DHCP. And then there's translation technologies, but single sign-on on all of these functions are those shared services that need v6 enablement. What other things does Windows offer? What other technologies do we need to consider with v6 introduction?
I think for enterprises, the biggest thing for me when I was sitting down and talking with them is, look, Windows absolutely does DNS. It absolutely does DHCP. It absolutely does IPAM. Like there's lots of things. It has transition capabilities. You can run DNS 6.4 on the device if you really wanted to. You can also run routing and remote access, right? You can run RAS on Windows 2. I would never use my Windows server as a routing device. It's fine for a lab if you just need to get something up running as a proof of concept, or you need it in a pinch or something like that. But it's nothing I would ever deploy in an enterprise environment and expect it to have that sort of high availability and performance. And I think at least for me, the DNS, the DHCP, and the IPAM sort of fits in that category. You absolutely can use the Windows stuff. It works. It's not like it's not capable of providing those functions. But I think given the current sort of high availability need requirement and flexibility, and to be honest, some of the v6 services that are super useful, probably looking at a third-party enterprise tool is going to make a lot more sense for those, and then splitting apart that function into dedicated appliances or dedicated devices to do those particular roles is going to be super important for sort of strengthening how well performance wise these both key critical services are for both Active Directory and the network, right? Because it goes hand in hand. And I think the implementations that Microsoft has done for DNS and DHCP v6, while sufficient, probably aren't robust enough to run at large scale, to do well with things like network automation, to do well for things like highly distributed site availability, right? And there's just a lot of things that I don't think necessarily fit in the corner of strength for Microsoft in that particular area. It's great that they provide them in there. So for like commercial organizations or small businesses, absolutely perfectly fine to use those. But when you have 250 DHCP v6 servers to administer all over the place, I don't think doing that in Microsoft products is probably the most efficient.
Oh, yeah.
Yes, I get you can do it with PowerShell. Totally understand that. I think I want a more centralized design architecture, similar to like actually Active Directory itself, right? To run and administer that. Even with AD integrated DNS, it's still very, very painful to do large scale DNS in the right way, and especially do it in an automated way with like an API. It's not particularly easy. And I don't know if that's been your experience too, Scott, but I mean, laying out a basic configuration just in a lab is not a big deal. Like you can totally point, click, and get your way through it. It's not an issue at all. But I think for big organizations, large enterprises, it's probably not the way I would tackle it. There are plenty of third-party products. I mean, it's Infoblox, Blue Cat. Well, Minimize just got bought by Blue Cat, right? So I think maybe the offerings are a little slimmer in terms of what's available out there. But yeah, there's definitely other offerings that are available that might do a better job helping support both Microsoft AD, but also your network for those core sets of critical services. And I do think the IPAM tool is, while it works on the Windows side, there's better ways to sort of manage your way through with IPAM in order to be able to like get a single source of truth into your network that is a little bit more robust. I don't know. It's strictly my opinion. I'm not saying that Microsoft and the Windows platform doesn't have those capabilities in it. It absolutely does. And I think the other one would be the DNS 6.4 really is not something I would run on the Windows platform at all. It's lacking some key functional capabilities, and you definitely want to get that function running on a different device and just delegating over and having it just do the lookup. So it can do the lookups back to your AD DNS server if you want to, or whatever third-party Infoblox or whatever else that you're running. But I don't think you don't want any DNS 6.4 necessarily running on AD at all.
Right. So I remember back, we had IPv6 Buzz show 117, where we had Richard Hicks on, and we talked about Microsoft and operating systems and features. And we had show 148, where we talked about Microsoft and CLAT support in Windows 11. What other resources can the audience go to find out more about IPv6 and Windows? And of course, your book, Practical IPv6 for Windows Administrators. What other resources would you recommend an AD administrator read up on?
Richard wrote 2 books himself. So if you're still doing stuff with direct access, he wrote the direct access book from A-Press, which is fantastic. So if you still have a direct access deployment for any reason, and the direct access relied on IPv6, which is one of the reasons that Richard is so familiar with v6 and a wonderful guest. He also wrote the Always On VPN. And so they're sort of correlating between the two because of they're both VPN sort of technologies in and with themselves. So I recommend both those. Joe Davies' Understanding IPv6 3rd edition, still a fantastic resource, fantastic reference, and that's from Microsoft Press. Joe, he wrote the original, what were they, the Cable Guy blog posts for Microsoft. So he wrote all of those, and he's just written a tomb of great information about IPv6, including shocking, mobile IPv6. So that we moved that back to the appendix in the 3rd edition, but it's all in there if for some reason you decide you want to read up on that.
Yeah,
I would say those are great. Microsoft's actually been posting up more information about v6 in regards to Azure, because you can bring your own address space to Azure. So a bunch of the Azure articles are being written now with sort of how do you support v6 within the public cloud side, simply because of the federal requirements that are pushing, all the public cloud providers to have more robust IPv6 support. That's true within the AWS side too. So they have articles that are talking about how to get v6 working with any of the virtual machines that you might operate within the public cloud. And those obviously include Windows instances if you need to get them operating in that way, along with any of the services that might attach to those instances. So if you're running Azure AD, or I forget what the heck they've renamed that to now for the 3rd time, or whatever name set they want to change it to. But yeah, getting all those services operational, M365, right? All the public services they have published lists with all the v6 addresses, and all of those resources are available up on Microsoft to be able to, permit list all of those, right? So that your SD-WAN appliance allows all of those v6 addresses to be connected to from your end clients to connect for, Microsoft services if you want to filter that way. Those are the sorts of things that Microsoft publishes up. They have blogs up on their docs site talking through all of that for Azure. So those are the resources that I would go and reference. You can hit my personal blog site. I still have tons of stuff up there on like PowerShell and other things. So that's just howfunky.com. You can check that out. Just do a quick search for PowerShell, and you should be able to pull up a bunch of stuff just to how to do v6 in PowerShell on the Windows platform, which might be useful for you. So you don't have to pay for my book. You can just grab it there. Not that you would pay for my book now anyway. I think you can just download it for free off Google. But that would be where I would start.
Wow, it's been tremendously enlightening having you on the show, Ed. It was great talking to you about IPv6 and Enterprise Active Directory. So how can the audience follow you on the internet? X, LinkedIn, blog, howfunky.com? How can the audience follow you?
Yeah, I think LinkedIn's probably the best. Just the linkedin.com/ehorley. Just hit me up there and reach out. Haven't been super active on X at all, so that's probably the best way. And we publish notes and comments and all the info for IPv6 Buzz up there too. It should have a few postings on all of that, so that's the best way to get a hold of me.
Okay. Thanks for being our guest, Ed.
Thanks, Scott. Thanks for joining us for this episode of IPv6 Buzz. If you've got feedback or a follow-up on this topic, send us a message at packetpushers.net/FU. We'd love to hear from you and continue the conversation.
Also, on packetpushers.net, you'll find a range of deep dive technical podcasts for IT pros, including heavy networking, heavy wireless, and day 2 cloud.
There's a whole lot more on the Packet Pushers site as well, such as tutorial videos and a networking job board to help you find or fill your next great role. So whether you're deep in your career or just starting up, Packet Pushers is the place to go to grow both your skills and your personal network.
So long, and until next time, we'll see you on the IPv6 internet.